video series is called Dying Dar's Way, Radically Real Spiels on the End of Life. I'm here today with Leslie Rowley, and she's going to tell us about Hereafter Partners.
Right. Well, Hereafter Partners was an accidental venture that my friend Dar helped nudge me into. I had recently, this spring, earlier in the year, gathered some people to have a frank, open, warm conversation about the worries and concerns that we had when thinking about our own end of life or the end of life of those that we love. And when I say we, I was really concentrating on a demographic of about 30 years old to 60 years old, which I was finding when my own family had to go through the death of my father 5 years ago, and my in-laws were going through my mother-in-law's death, that we weren't prepared, because this cohort especially is not imbued with the language to talk about death, to be adjacent to death, because we have over-medicalized, in my opinion, the end-of-life process for so many decades, and we've really removed ourselves from feeling as though it is a part of life. And
Right.
so when I held this event, and many people, more than I expected,
Like 20?
over 50.
Like over 50?
Over 50 came to my house one Sunday afternoon to talk about their worries and concerns, and really wonderful experiences with death as well. I knew we were onto something, and I really thought everyone wants to talk about this, but no one's yet been invited. And it's hard to invite people to talk about death, but even more, it's hard to take up that invitation when hopefully it seems so far off and we know it's all around us.
Right, but that's when we want people to be thinking about it. We don't want it to all get pushed off to the end where it feels urgent.
That's right.
Because it is urgent. We don't want to be dealing with death as an emergency.
That's right.
We want to live.
Yes, and so when one of my dear friends told me about one of her dear friends who wanted to have a similar event in Princeton, we got together. And if anyone knows Dar, they know we're going to do this thing. And so we quickly put something together. And I think it was you who said, well, what goes behind the comma after Leslie Rowley? And I said, oh, I have to have an organization now. So that was the birth of Hereafter Partners, which really is an organization meant to start making conversations about death, particularly among younger people, more every day, and that we can approach it from literature, book clubs, or from needing to get all your stuff together, just checklists and things. So we're kind of a resource clearinghouse, I like to think about, but also a community that we're building.
Okay, so assuming that we are talking to people who are willing to move into the action steps, walk us through the process. What are the basic documents, plans that people need to do in order to spare, and this one is really important to me, unnecessary pain, expense, and confusion for their loved ones?
Right. I think that is actually a jumping in point for a lot of people, that it's less about their own feelings about how I want to die.
That's where I live.
It's about what do I want to leave, not only in legacy, but also in lack of turmoil for my loved ones.
Right.
And so when actually we do meet with larger groups of people, we have boards all over saying, what are your questions and concerns about medical, and what are your questions and concerns about legal or financial? And those, everyone has those concerns. What is probate anyway? But it's the spiritual / emotional / family related issues that are kind of salient for everyone. And if you really unpack them, they all have a tie back to, I haven't gotten my finances in order, I haven't gotten my medical needs, wishes in order, and I've certainly not talked about them. So it's all interconnected. So in terms of kind of the stuff you need to get together, we keep talking about a binder, having that binder for someone. And it's either a binder or, now more people are talking about electronic ways, but then get those passwords. And so legal, we're talking about a will, of course, a medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, your deciding about long-term care insurance kind of goes into the medical, but then you need those documentations
Right.
and understanding who beneficiaries are and that sort of thing. And then financial, and this is just a short list. There are longer, more in-depth things for financial, all your estate planning documents, trusts, if you've figured those out, hopefully you will be urged to do that. All of your financial accounts, statements, access documents for the financial power of attorney, again, real estate, a whole checklist of things. And then it's more of the philosophical things, the questions about what are your values and how do you want those expressed in the care that you get, either at the end of your life or, there are also discrete situations where you may be incapacitated for a time during some sort of emergency event well before your ultimate end of life, and yet you're going to need support from those around you to help you make decisions or help make your decisions known.
Good point. So a lot of what you're doing is not necessarily death preparation. It's you really need to be doing this all along the way.
Right. I was actually talking to a millennial friend of mine the other day, and he was saying, we do a lot of risky stuff. And I said, yeah, when you go up mountain climbing,
right.
I want to make sure that you know that your families and loved ones know what should happen if you get into an accident, and you can't be the one to talk about that. Right. So it's not great stuff to always be thinking about, what's the next emergency around the corner. But it is in your mind. Even if you're not accessing it, we're all kind of thinking about the worst case scenarios. Right. And if we don't take the time now to kind of get that out of our head and do some thinking and do some planning and do some talking with our loved ones, it's just going to sit there rattling around. Mm-hmm. So why don't we, do one for our mental health now and start having those conversations with ourselves and with our loved ones?
So you and I created an hour and 15-minute video with all of the essential people you would need involved in the process. The attorney, the estate planning people, the funereal people, the medicinal marijuana people, the people from Compassion and Choices in Washington. You might want to say a little bit about that. And you put together, Leslie put this together. It's beautiful. A document, it's all a PDF file of every document you need in the state of New Jersey to do a responsible job. Can you tell our friends how to access those documents?
Sure. So they're on a website called hereafterpartners.org. And not only are those PDF resources available, but links to the video from that evening, as well as some of the Dying Dar's Way resources, tips and tricks from somebody who's been thinking so deeply about this. And they really are resources that you can pick and play. Mm-hmm. What's relevant to you now? What do you think that you can access in the mental state you're in?
Oh, right. I even made up a little document. Here's the checklist of everything that you would do in the ideal world, but here's the parking lot. You can put things over there and just say, I know it's safe, it's identified, but it's in the parking lot because I'm not ready to, say, draft my own obituary or make decisions about estate planning yet. It's all right. You know that it's there when you're ready to get back to it.
That's right. And so many, we've been talking about how there's no one path and there's no one checklist that you can do in order, right? So somebody like me, I am having a hard time writing that letter to my children that I want them to have. Mm-hmm. And I know that it's the first draft and I'll probably add to it, hopefully for the next decades and decades and decades. But I actually started it. And even starting some of these things is really important. But knowing, you know what? That one might take a little bit more time because of the mental place I am with holding my children because they're growing up too fast. But I think some other people may think dealing with finances is hard where they are, and they don't really want to do that right now. So find the way in for you, and you have some great tips and tricks about that.
Okay, yeah, and what I'm hearing you say is how we live is preparation for how we die. So even if you write a letter that you never intend to send, or you just, if you have the habit of journaling, or somehow I call it leading a more examined life. This is very non-specific but very effective preparation for when you do have to think more seriously and, in my case, urgently, if I haven't done my job, to prepare for a good dying.
Right. And this is, we're talking, I think I've been speaking about making these plans for ourselves. There's also the other side of it, particularly for my cohort, who are thinking about the plans that their own parents need, or elder loved ones should be making, may have made, may not have already made. And so one key feature, I am not my mother, I am not any of my relatives, I'm me, and they are they. And so when I find one thing difficult and one thing easy, it may be very different for the entry points for my loved ones. So we also have conversation prompts that I think you should really be reading through your own lens, but then say, would that work for Mom? Do I have to be really organized because she's that kind of person and get her through more of the pedantic checklist type of things? Or is she more spiritual and legacy, and who needs to have this recipe handed down? And maybe that's how you enter a conversation.
Okay, so I'm hearing, I love it to be couched in this phrase of how to enter the end of life planning conversation, or how to enter the death conversation. Highly individualized and highly non-specific, as long as you do it while it's important but not yet urgent. And there is a person, like you're the identified person in your family group who's thinking about this. And it sounds like it's a slow, consistent accumulation, exploring possibilities, testing the water, seeing how people will respond.
Right, and it certainly doesn't always have to be led with, so let's talk about death,
No,
everybody.
right. No.
So sometimes it's, Mom, what's your favorite activity?
Right.
That if you couldn't do this anymore, gosh, the day would not be the same. And that really starts a conversation about values, about a life lived. It may prompt stories from the past that are so important just to hear if they really don't even make it out on paper or a decision.
This is an important point. I have heard this on several occasions, that if it's not an easy conversation to enter, sometimes you can just create a better terrain for the conversation with reminiscing about something that's important to the we'll call it the identified person.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Another avenue in too is, Mom, I have a friend who's dying, or I have a friend that just got this diagnosis, or I have a friend whose mother just, and I've been thinking about these things for myself.
Right.
So that's been a nice way for a lot of people to launch into something that might still be very scary for themselves, but they're pulling their family in just because they've had to go as kind of bystanders through that process already.
So I run a nonprofit organization where we transmit program and wisdom through personal narratives, storytelling, developing our stories. And I'm hearing too that sharing the experience of another person, sharing your story non-specifically with no intention to drive the conversation, is an entry point.
That's right.
Okay.
And actually my first event, I started with my personal story about my father's end of life, and it's not a story I would hope anyone else repeats. Right. There were really difficult moments in it. There were really lovely, wonderful moments in it. But at least I could share that. And then a number of other people shared both their kind of death horror stories and some really lovely, I was holding the hand of someone as they passed into this other part of life. And I think that was instructive to a lot of people who might even still be just scared. And to hear people say, we build a lot of these things up because we don't know. And as soon as we hear stories or we learn through books about what kind of breathing changes happen at the end of life. We were reading this wonderful book by Catherine Mannix called With the End in Mind. And she talks,
made me read it.
I did make her read it. And she talks about kind of phases that you will see that hospice workers and palliative care workers have seen time and time again as we take our last breaths. And a friend of mine said, gosh, I wish I had just read that chapter before I was with my dad, because I would have anticipated, oh, this is not freakish, or this is not, he's not in pain and he's not struggling. Like this is our bodies doing what it does, what they do. So just having someone else's lived experience or hearing about it, I think gets you a little less frightened, right?
Yes, and I'm going to bring it back now to where you started, which was we have so over medicalized, sanitized the process of dying and the process of death, that somehow we aren't having these conversations because we're not around. You know, Grandma, I used the example of being Irish, and a generation or two ago, Grandma would have been laid out on the dining room table. We all would have been reciting poetry and drinking whiskey, and
or not even paying attention, because that was just kind of what was going on.
And everybody did it. It was normalized. Certainly, I come from farmers. I was raised on take me behind the barn and shoot me like an old horse. From the time I was a little girl, my father was normalizing the death conversation. I didn't like it. Like, don't expect that people are going to like every attempt that you make to draw them in, but it was normalized for me.
Right, and actually, that kind of, he was trying to be instructive with that, but we've been hearing a lot of people, their defense mechanism is, oh, well, you know, when I get to that part, shoot me anyway. And that's not actually a very helpful conversation, right? So there are many other ways that we can think about helping people through their journey, but also helping people not have to question, well, what did he really mean by that? And where are his dividing lines of when life is worth living and life is, needs to take its course? So I think we can say those things, but if we don't kind of prod and say, well, Dad, what do you really mean? I don't really want to do that.
And he didn't get his wish. He always said, I don't want to rust out. I want to wear out. He wanted to be worn out, but he lived to 102.
Oh my gosh.
Had this very extended life in which he did eventually rust out. I guess what I took away from it was an appreciation of, even though it was a sloppy delivery, he got the point across that we talk about it. Yeah. So can you tell us, before we close, a little bit about your planned future events, gathering people into your informal events at home, and then the bigger plan?
Sure. Well, who knows what the bigger plan will be, but right now we're trying to kind of replicate the larger events, but on any scale. So we may have 8 people come over and talk about general ideas about end of life, or we could have workshops that, okay, tonight we're going to bring all of our financial documents. No one's going to look at numbers, but we're going to put them in a binder, and we're going to make sure that we have all the account numbers ready for people and figure out what pieces we have missing. So more kind of tactile, hands-on accountability, really. Because everybody says, I know I need a will. But if somebody's not saying, okay, have you done that will? I asked you yesterday, have you done that will? What about last week? Did you do the will? We may not get there. So I think one of the services that we can provide is a little bit of accountability, but also a little bit of, demystifying and being fun. So, finding those artistic things that are happening. There's a wonderful art exhibit that's related to health and death that we might be going to. Princeton Art Museum. But also, there are wonderful readings. We actually have a book club or a book discussion group. No one has to join a club and always talk about death, but can come and discuss when they like. So it's that sort of thing. Of course, my large-scale vision is let's have a big festival and bring the entire community, all ages, together. That may be a little bit down the road, but I think it's an area that people want to be invited to, need to be invited to, and once we're all around the table, I think it'll get a lot easier.
And I am just so grateful to Leslie Rowley for normalizing the conversation. Thank you.
I love you.